Welcome. I call to order this January 13th, 2021 meeting of the Needham Finance Committee. As a preliminary matter, permit me to confirm that all members and persons anticipated on the agenda are present and can hear me. Members, when I call your name, please respond in the affirmative. Josh Levy, Vice Chair.
Here.
Barry Kaufman.
Here.
John Connolly. Did we lose John?
He vanished.
Looks like we lost it now.
He was here. Oh, we'll come back to him. Tom Jacob.
Here.
Rick Lunetta.
Here.
Louise Miller. Here. Dick Riley.
Here,
Jim Healy.
Here.
And hopefully John, since he was here, will come back to the Zoom meeting. Louise Misgard.
Yes.
Good evening. This open meeting of the Needham Finance Committee is being conducted remotely consistent with Governor Baker's executive order of March 12, 2020, due to the current state of emergency in the Commonwealth due to the outbreak of the COVID-19 virus. In order to mitigate transmission of the virus, we have been advised and directed by the Commonwealth to suspend public gatherings. And as such, the governor's order suspends the requirement of the open meeting law to have all meetings in a publicly accessible physical location. Further, all members of public bodies are allowed and encouraged to participate remotely. The order allows public bodies to meet entirely remotely so long as reasonable public access is afforded so that the public can follow along with the deliberations of the meeting. Ensuring public access does not ensure public participation unless such participation is required by law, except for the agenda item entitled Citizen Request to Address the Finance Committee. The meeting will not feature public comment. For this meeting, the Needham Finance Committee is convening by a Zoom app as posted on the town's website. Please note that the meeting is now being recorded and some attendees are participating by video conference. Accordingly, be aware that others may be able to see you, and take care not to screen share your computer. All supporting materials that have been provided members of this body will be available on the town's website unless otherwise noted. The public is encouraged to follow along using the posted agenda unless the chair notes otherwise. Each vote taken in the meeting will be conducted by a roll call vote. I will introduce each speaker on the agenda. As they conclude their remarks, the chair will go down the line of members, inviting each by name to provide any further comment, questions, or motions. As a first order of business, I would ask for a motion that this meeting, should it get disconnected, be continued on the committee's next meeting on January 20th, 2021, if a technical problem develops. Is there such a motion?
So moved.
second,
Second.
Thank you. With that, we will turn to the first item on the agenda.
All in favor, say aye. Don't we have to vote it?
Oh, sorry. Yes, we should have voted the technical problem. Technically, I need to take a roll call vote. So, Rick,
Yes.
Dick,
yes,
Louise,
Yes.
Barry,
Yes.
Tom,
Yes.
Josh,
Yes.
Jim.
Yes, sorry about that.
That's okay. And John, thank you for keeping me on
Yes.
task. I appreciate that. First item on the agenda, citizen request to address the Finance Committee. Dave, do we have any citizens in the meeting?
I am not seeing anybody's raised hand.
Okay. Thank you. The next item on the agenda is approval of the minutes of January 6, 2021. Does anybody have any comments or?
I move their approval.
Second.
Second.
Great. All in favor? Rick,
Yes.
Dick, so moved.
Yes,
Louise,
Yes.
Barry,
Yes.
Tom,
Yes.
Josh,
Yes.
Jim,
Yes.
John,
Yes.
and myself, yes. Thank you. Next item on the agenda, budget department requests. Let's go from the top and take the first one, legal department.
Carol, I had that one, and I think it should be very brief. I sat in on the discussion that Kate and Dave had back in November, and as you know, former town council, Dave Tobin passed away last spring, sadly, after many years of great service to our town. And as you know, historically, in his role, the budget was contained two components. One was a salary component, and then the second was a component for expenses, which were spent either on services that Dave provided for the town that were outside of what was covered within the salary, or expenses paid to other attorneys working on other legal matters for the town. That has now been changed for FY22, where the town has engaged a law firm in Wellesley called Myers and Harrington to provide town council services. They will bill for their time, and the budget that's set forth for 2022 is a level funded budget amount of $329,000, which is similar to what it was in FY21. With the expectation being that the services provided by Chris Heap and others in his firm, and then any other additional counsel that is determined to be hired for case-specific matters, their expenses will be handled and covered through this component of the budget.
Okay. And there's no, was town council receiving any benefits? So was that number?
The salary,
Yeah.
the former town,
Former town
Dave?
council. Yeah.
The former
Yes.
town accountant did not receive health insurance. The town did pay Social Security and Medicare tax.
Okay, so then what they expended last year relative to this year really is all for legal fees or outside services then?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you. Louise?
Can I just ask, so John, if you're going to stay on as liaison of this particular group, I'd like us to look at how the legal services are, what it is that we spend money on. So where I am now, we actually have two components to the legal services budget. One is a flat fee for all of the regular town items such as town meeting, zoning, etc., that need to be done, and then additional fees in addition to that. So I think where we've really moved to a different model here, where we have an outside firm that's billing us on an hourly rate, I think it might be helpful to look at that at the end of the year, and maybe after we have a couple of years of history, to see where our services are being expended and what we can do for a fee agreement.
Sure. So as you know, I mean, this is the select board is the group that went ahead and did this, and they didn't consult with us, so they just went ahead and did it. So
I know that.
so we're trailing the process, so to speak.
Yeah.
But I'd be happy to take that up with them.
Thank you.
Was it procured?
I don't believe so, Jim. But I can't.
I know.
Let's put it this way: it was procured in some manner. What manner that was, I don't know.
Madam Chair, could I ask a few questions?
Sure, Dick, sorry.
So along the lines of due diligence, what experience have we had with this particular firm?
So I'll speak, and then Dave, maybe you can add in. So Chris Heap is the particular attorney. He was there at both the town meeting in the spring and then the town meeting that we just had this fall. And I know that his firm, and because I've had experiences with them in my other life, provides a lot of town council services to various towns in the Commonwealth. And so Needham and other towns, they provide legal work to. And Chris, I think that's pretty much exclusively what he does.
Okay.
Madam Chair, may I bring in the town manager?
Yes, certainly. Thank you.
And Madam Chair, while we're waiting for the town manager, specific to the question, legal services are exempt from procurement. And by the town charter, the select board appoints town council.
Could I add to that?
I know that, David. I get that. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it.
Madam Chair?
Yes. Kate.
So prior to Dave's death, the board appointed Mears and Harrington as adjunct counsel so that we would have seamless counsel because Dave was sick at the time. The board agreed to next summer have a discussion about what procurement might be and conducted in terms of future of town council.
Yeah, I mean, I'm aware of other towns that do it through an RFP process. And I would think that the select board would want to explore that.
Any other questions on legal department? Thank you. Turning to the municipal parking program.
Madam Chair, I will bring in the individuals that will address questions. They are Sandy Sincotta, Karis Lustig, Cecilia Semchek, and Edward Olson.
Thank you. And Josh, did you have this one?
Yes, I have a couple questions. I actually didn't get to meet in advance with Karis and her team about this specifically. Karis, do you want to introduce this a bit?
I actually would like to have Cecilia provide the introduction because she put the specific budget together. But I don't believe there's any significant changes in how we're operating the municipal parking budget as we go into the next year.
Yeah, that's correct. So pretty much it's similar to last year. The only slight increases have been just due to the lease agreement that the town has for the parking lots. There was a slight increase in the agreement, so that price has gone up, as well as previously mentioned in the DPW's budget, the markings contract has increased, and so there is a slight increase for any paint-related markings that we would do for municipal parking, as well as an increase in order to maintain the dumpster enclosures and the additional dumpsters that we've added at Chapel Street and Dedham Ave. Just to repair the fences, there is an additional $5,000 added, as well as a move to lighting repair that was switched over moved out of municipal parking into the electric, light, and gas budget.
Thank you. So I guess a couple questions I had. Last year there was a request for pest control at that Chapel Street, Dedham Ave parking lot. And I think we moved that funding to the Health and Human Services budget. So I guess I'm curious about the dumpsters. If those are for pest management, did those come out of your budget or did they come out of the Health and Human Services budget?
So the pest control is out of Health and Human Services. This is for the physical fence and guardrail, like the fence around the dumpster enclosures. It's to repair that fence. It's not necessarily related to just pests.
Got it. And then there's just one other expense that I saw. It was for pavement, curbing, and sidewalk repair. So last year, so this year, there's a request for 9,000 on that line. I think last year, 7,000 of that request was for repairing the curbing outside of the Middlesex Bank, which I assume is repaired now. So I guess I'm just curious why that's still in that budget request for fiscal 22.
There are periodic repairs. The focus of last year's funds was a specific issue, but they do periodic repairs to our parking lots, and our parking lots, although they've been more recently paved, are now starting to come, some of the elements of those parking lots are starting to come towards the end of their life cycle. So that's why that element is still in the budget. I can certainly talk to the highway department to see if there's any specific area right now they would be targeting based on damage that they're seeing at the moment. We can get that information back to you.
Yeah, thanks. I'd appreciate that. Those were the only questions I had.
Great, Louise?
So do we receive revenue as a town from these municipal parking lots?
I'd ask Dave to answer that, but I believe the answer is yes.
The answer is yes. There are fees charged to businesses to acquire parking permits for their employees, and there are some rental of spaces for businesses for their employees to comply with planning board requirements.
Thank you.
Just a follow-up question, if I may. How does that revenue compare to the operating expenses?
The revenue generally accounts for approximately 2/3 to 70%. This budget maintains all the lots, and there's a lot of lots that's 2-hour free parking, so there's no revenue generation, but we still have to maintain those sections of the parking lot.
So Madam Chair, I think I had this conversation with Dave a couple of years ago. Between fiscal years 2017 and 2019, revenues were between $105,000 and $108,000 per year.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
This might be a suggestion that we would consider whether or not the fees should be, where we do charge them, should be adjusted so that we cover the total costs of the parking. That would seem to me a reasonable step to take.
The fees have been adjusted several times. Of course, now there's very little income coming in.
Right.
Because the number of permits have been taken, and also that was one of the fees that was cut for this parking season. There are some complications when setting fees. Is when a fee is being generated to generate more income to pay for people who are not paying, that becomes a tax. And there's only one kind of tax allowed for municipalities, and that's real estate taxes. That's the Sudbury decision.
But there's got to be a little
I'm
flexibility.
sorry, that's the Emerson decision.
In the permit we're charging to employer, if it's $8 a spot or $10 a spot, I will doubt that $2 makes a difference of a tax versus a non-tax. But I just throw that out for consideration.
Yep, and we do sell more permits than there are spaces available. Parking's not guaranteed.
And I would suggest that it shouldn't be guaranteed for anyone that gives it up. In other words, if they decide that because they're remote, they don't need to do it anymore, that's fine, but then they should go to the bottom of the list. At least that's what we do up at the medical school.
Are the permits sold annually, Dave, or?
Yes, the renewal process happens in April, and the year runs from May to April 30th.
Okay.
So we're coming up for the next renewal period.
And I'm assuming you don't allocate expense or have a way of allocating expense to the permit-only spaces versus the other spaces that aren't sold as permits, which are covered under this budget, correct?
Correct. It's not allocated in that way. One part of the cost includes leases of lots for 2-hour parking, for instance.
Okay, are there any other questions on the municipal parking program? Louise?
I just have one more on the lease for the library lot. Who is that money going to?
The Christ Episcopal Church.
The Episcopal Church, thank you.
All right. Thank you. Select Board Town Manager.
Madam Chair, I have a few other individuals to bring into the meeting and a few to take out of the meeting.
Okay.
If you give me a second so I don't accidentally suspend the wrong person.
Yeah. Their voice.
Madam Chair and Ms. Fitzpatrick, I think everyone is in.
Madam Chair, I'm happy to introduce the Town Manager and Select Board FY22 budget. Before we entertain questions, just a couple highlights that I think are appropriate to take a peek at in this budget. Number one, embedded in this budget is the position transfer of the existing Manager of Economic Development, going from the Planning and Community Development Department to the Office of the Town Manager. Also, you'll notice that the expense line item has a little noticeable bubble in it relative to last year. And also on this budget is a DSR4 to fund the current Public Information Officer position that's represented in the DSR4. And if you recall, 2 years ago, town meeting funded this position. Now it's time to transfer it from that funding source, which dries up, to the operating budget. In terms of the transfer of the Manager of Economic Development position, when Kate and I chatted, she certainly can do a far better job at this than I. But there are a couple of things that made it important to do that. There's no new funding here. It's just moving from Peter to give to Paul. A kind of a realignment of this position's focus from planning and zoning to more of an economic development framework. The position requires more access to Town Manager and the Select Board and the Council of Economic Advisors because of the focus, and the position will report directly to the Assistant Town Manager, Director of Operations. In terms of expenses, that blip in the line item basically talks to two major items. The first is the cost for 4 assessment centers. And those positions in question are 2 police positions, one of lieutenant and one of sergeant. And on the fire department, the deputy chief and the chief position. Also, finance, I guess, so Dave in his kind of doing things is now requiring licensing and maintenance for individual softwares, no longer to reside solely in IT, but to be dispersed into the department in which it uses them. And so besides the assessment centers that I spoke of a second ago, Human Resources has just purchased an applicant tracking system, which kind of brings its entire operation into the 3rd millennia, which is good. And consequently, the cost of maintenance and license is transferred to this budget. And then lastly, the DSR4. I'm sure all of you remember the discussions of a couple of years ago over this position. In the binder that you all have speaks to the accomplishments. There's a couple more here that I think it's worth noting, and then Kate certainly can speak to it. There's a greater necessity on the part of the town to get out information, and that's been very obvious relative to COVID and some of the health things that the town has had to get out. Media has shown a greater interest for a wide variety of reasons in the town. So long, it's very important to have someone who is skilled in responding, not only themselves in terms of crafting messages, but also teaching department heads and those that be inclined to speak to the media how to appropriately address things relative to the town. One thing that's important to residents in the past is, as Kate related to me, residents would have requests and inquiries. She would take that, go to a department head, get the answer, get back, and all that was an elongated way. This position takes it more immediate and it moves it forward quickly. And then lastly, the person really serves as a communication SME. And there really wasn't anyone truly here to do all that stuff, save Kate and a couple others. And so this really has gotten the town ahead of all of this. And so inclusive of the DSR 4 of the 98,163, and as presented in this budget of 1,323,253, it represents an increase of around $200,000 or 19.2% relative to the transfer of that position, the expense blurb, and the DSR 4. Madam Chair, I would invite the town manager and then the committee to ask questions, as is our normal course. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Rick, I think you did an excellent job of explaining the changes in the budget that we're proposing. The Economic Development Manager position, and Amy Hilson, who is our Economic Development Manager, is here, and many of you probably haven't met her, so there she is. When we created the position many years ago, it was actually through an operating override, and it was assigned to my office. When we consolidated the planning and community development departments, including conservation and ZBA, in the 2009 timeframe, we thought it made sense to move the position down to that consolidated department. We have found it's become increasingly clear that the economic development role needed better access to town management and to the select board, because the Council of Economic Advisors is a select board committee, and they're focused primarily on attracting and retaining businesses in the community, and weren't always they played a different role from the planning board, which was in a permitting and zoning and thinking of that role in a different way. So the previous director of economic development and the planning director and I agreed that it would make better sense to move the position back to this office. But they work very closely together on items of mutual interest. I don't know, Madam Chair, if the chair of the select board would want to add anything to the presentation. Oh, and the vice chair is here too.
Yes. No, I mean, it in our experience previously, it makes that position much more effective to have direct communication with the town manager. There are many issues that come up that line of communication is more executive than it is planning and community development.
I do think that Rick did a great job promoting the role of the public information officer, and we'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Dick?
Actually, my question is a general question, not specifically to this position. So if there are questions in that position, I'll hold off. Hearing none, I will, oops, Jim.
Jim?
At this point, I need to know a lot more about this. I'm really not in favor of either change. This has been a long project in coming, and all of a sudden there's a dramatic shift. So I'm going to need more information about why this is a good idea. I mean, the Economic Development Advisory Committee, which frankly is not elected to do anything, I've been concerned about them for a long time. So I'd like to, at some point, I'm going to have to get more information.
What,
Madam Chair, could I make a suggestion that as a matter of financial impact, whether it reports to the town manager or through another department, I don't think has in and of itself has a financial impact. Whether we have the position or not clearly has a financial impact, but where it reports doesn't strike me as having a significant financial impact.
I think that's my point, Dick. That's my point. So maybe at some point it no longer has a benefit. That's my point.
unless the move is more to, as Kate said, work with the Council of Economic Advisors and hopefully drive additional commerce to the town of Needham. So Kate, do you want to comment on that?
I think that one of the goals of many of us here on this call is to reduce the pressure on the residential tax and attracting and retaining businesses, particularly large businesses that will increase our new growth and bring in revenue that can help reduce that pressure is something that is a high priority for me, and it's a high priority for the Board of Selectmen. I think that the role of the Economic Development Department has had great impact in bringing in significant projects such as NBC Universal, TripAdvisor, and Children's Hospital that will provide some of that tax relief. I don't know if the Select Board, Madam Chair, would want to add anything to that.
I will, Madam Chair, if I could. I would just say with that position, to me and to us, it's really the first point of contact for new businesses that want to establish something in the town of Needham. And I know from retail stores to restaurants to people with entrepreneurial ideas, they go, and that's the first stop, and say, is this possible? Can I do this within the current zoning? What would it take to get this business off the ground, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we've had great success because of that, using that position for that reason. And I know recently there's been an effort to go during COVID times, door to door to these businesses to see how they can better be supported. We have a couple of businesses coming to us that have come through that office that they want to opine on.
And if I may add, a lot of what we're doing with respect to trying to save the business community, especially in our downtown areas, because of the impact of COVID-19, requires these businesses know what the town is doing on a very intimate basis and to work with each other. And our economic development officer has been very effective at communicating with the businesses and between them and us. And it's paid off. We've gotten a lot of cooperation. Some of the businesses have given way to some of the interests on the restaurants. It's a very important position for the town. And if you look around at the other communities with whom we deal, they all have these positions because it's effective. It helps the business community and it helps the town support that community because it pays off in our tax revenue and in the economic life of the town as a whole.
Jim.
I don't agree. So
Fine,
again,
we disagree.
I might, maybe I can be convinced as the days and weeks move on, but we've given away a lot of tax breaks down in the industrial park. We've still got some problems with vacancies down there. So this whole idea of self-promotion of what this position has done, I don't buy at all. And Lee Newman, as far as I knew, was the person that you could go to and ask for what the rules are with respect to the zoning and the planning and so forth. At this point, without knowing more, it's just me, but I think there needs to be a lot more review.
Josh.
I was just going to make a comment about the public information officer position. I think 2 years ago when we discussed this, there's a lot of questions and maybe even skepticism among this board. And I think my recollection is that there were kind of two needs that were envisioned that this role probably may or may not satisfy. We didn't know at the time. I think the two needs were to help residents find out information in a self-directed manner. I think that's through the website in particular. And I think there's a lot of questions about how to improve the website. And then there was the second part was kind of external, answering media requests, managing requests from media and not necessarily residents themselves. And I guess from what I see, the website hasn't changed much, and I think it's still just as difficult sometimes to find information for residents as it was 2 years ago. So I really would hope that that is able to be improved either through this position or through another mechanism. At the time, I think we were also told that this position might also help support other departments like the library, for instance, in their efforts to redesign the website. But I don't think that happened either. So that's just some of the questions I guess I had about whether this position is going to help support those efforts in the future, or if that might fall on another position.
Louise?
So I had some comments on the public information officer position as well. I think I'd like to know what the goals for this position would be going forward, and I'd like to understand better what the accomplishments were for the last year.
So we're happy to provide, I can get you the goals for the coming year. I think the DSR4 highlighted, I think, quite a few of the accomplishments, a lot of growth in our social media presence, creation of a listserv for response to the COVID crisis, the creation of a wraparound website for COVID, significant training for staff and for elected officials on better responding to the media, more media coverage of events and happenings in Needham. Those are a couple examples.
So I'm not aware of any training that the finance committee received.
Well, other than perhaps annual town meeting postings of presentations, I know that did happen. It was never expressed to me that the finance committee would want training on interacting with the media on behalf of the town. We'd be happy to do that.
Okay, so I struggled with that posting for town meeting. So, you know, just saying. Anyway.
Always provide more help on that front.
So, oh, Jim, go ahead. Sorry.
What's the matter with Matt and Mo? They can do it. What are we talking about? We need a press secretary? I mean, these guys are incredibly bright and they're able to articulate anything. That's why we elected them. So I mean, we are so formalizing and everything we do here. And all it does is basically create more cost and more expense. I don't get it. I mean, if Mo got up and told me what he wanted, that'd be perfect. If the press called, I'd have no problem with Mo responding. If it was Matthew, any one of the selectmen. So I don't really get the whole formalization of it.
Well, I'll just give you one example, if I may, Madam Chair. The select board consists of 5 people. In some of these circumstances, you would get 5 different answers on a particular situation. You need to have somebody who can give a consistent message many times. The other aspect of this is we're in the middle of a major pandemic here. And part of dealing with that requires a lot of public education. We have a professional who can do that and has been doing it effectively. So to me, as a select board member, this is a vital position. And I'll let Matt speak to what it is.
And I would, especially in these times, and I understand the comment and thank you. And we could absolutely handle questions that come at us. And typically when there are questions, the chair goes through Cindy and says, here are the answers to those questions. But I think on a day-to-day basis, answering the questions, talking to the business community, talking to the press, dealing with COVID, dealing with everything around town meeting, that would usually rely, I think, on the town manager or her office. And I think with the overload of information and requests, I think it was vital to have Cindy communicate out to the public. And I really think it made a difference in how we responded as a town during this pandemic. And I think they're going to be, as there always are, future things moving forward. And it has been, and I agree, I'm fine to communicate our positions. But this is more day-to-day operations of communication with businesses in the town and all other aspects of running the town that's grown much more over time. And I think it's been a terrific asset, a tremendous asset. And But to Josh's point about the website, I think that is something that we do want to work on and get a better handle of how we communicate that way. Because the joke is that if you want something, you Google it, Needham, and then the question instead of going to the website and trying to search for it. So I do think that is something we have to get better. But as far as putting out the information on Instagram, the police department is now pushing information out. The fire department's pushing information out. We get to say what the businesses now have 2-hour parking. You know, there's a lot of information that we push out that we were not able to do before. And I think that's vital in communication.
So, Kate, I have a question on that position because I was also skeptical of the position. But I have to say, at least I agree with Josh on the website, but with respect to all the COVID-related alerts, education, even some of the like mask up program in Needham that I know Tim McDonald has worked on. I'm assuming that the public information officer is behind all of that. So maybe you could speak to that.
Absolutely. So Tim has sought grants for us to be able to do that kind of promotion, and the Mask Up, the current one that's going on in the square. Another one that Cindy's working on is with the Needham Public Schools to create a campaign aimed at teenagers to try to get them to wear their masks so that they don't infect other people, because as you've seen, the great transmission is through household transmission. But yes, those examples are trying to get the word out on the items that we receive. Absolutely we receive an incredible amount of calls of people who want more messaging about masks and messaging about vaccines. It really, as Matt and Mo said, we pushed out on a daily basis for months and months and months information to the public on the COVID pandemic. We have a huge listserv now of people who follow that. Now we do it once a week. That information would not have been out there if we didn't have this position.
Louise?
So I think we have to separate COVID though from the position. And I think federal, state government have provided grants for communication because COVID was a particular situation, continues to be a particular situation where communications are necessary. So I think we need to understand what this position would do if it were not a COVID year.
I hear you, Louise. I'll get you more information.
Thank you. Thank you, Kate. I know you do.
Dick? You're muted.
I have a broad question and then a specific one. Rick, in his introduction, indicated there's roughly a $200,000 increase in the costs. A lot of that is from transfers from one budget to another. How much of that 200,000 is pure increase in this department?
98, I think. 98,163.
Okay. One of those areas of increase is for 2 new assessment centers for, what is the assessment center? What does it do? And
Sure. For promotion in the civil service roles, there needs to be a portion, generally speaking, a portion of a test and a portion of an assessment center in which officers in the ranks go through experiential exercises like inboxes, community meetings, and things like that. So these are run by a consultant who videotapes it. There are usually a panel of 3 assessors from different communities who come and evaluate and provide scores. For the civil service roles, which in this case would be the sergeant, the lieutenant, and the deputy, this is actually a negotiated and delegated role from the civil service department for us, and it's a required component. The other one is for the fire chief, and this has become a standard practice for us for the heads of the public safety departments, is to have that kind of an experiential recruitment process.
but we're doubling the number now presumably we haven't had a double the number of people who are being reviewed. How come it's being doubled?
So in the police department, we, every 2 years, we need to do a lieutenant and a sergeant, and this is the year for that. And then the deputy, it depends on when that comes up in the list process for civil service. And the fire chief is coming to the end of his tenure. And so this number will fluctuate annually depending
Okay.
on the number of leadership positions.
That's helpful to understand.
Okay.
Thank you.
Got it.
Thank you. Jim?
I have a question and a comment. Question is, you're telling us that some of these are required contractually, and I'd like to get that confirmation. Second, I've been part of a lot of the assessments back in the day, and at the end of the assessment, the Board of Selectmen actually voted to go in the direction they always wanted to go. They didn't even go with the assessment. And I was part of it, so I saw it. So how do you justify why it's so great to have these assessments when in fact the board doesn't always actually follow what the assessor says?
Well, I'm not sure which one you're referring to, but we could, talk about that later. The civil service requirements are that either for the police lieutenant, the police sergeant, and the deputy, we would either be having a completely test-based promotion on that, so that your highest level ranking officer in the police department would be appointed only by a test. And that's something that the community has not wanted to do for years. So as an integral part of the promotion process for sergeant and lieutenant, we now have this assessment center component. That's true for the deputy as well. It's also included in their collective bargaining agreements, but if that wasn't there, we would be running only by a test.
I'm not going to get into personalities because that's not appropriate, but I was there and I saw what happened.
Louise?
Question, is the fire chief retiring? Is that what you're anticipating?
By the end of 2022.
Okay.
John?
Carol, I had a question, and like some of the others, 2 years ago, I was skeptical of the public information officer position, but I've seen the benefits of it over the last 2 years. My question is, what's the harm in leaving it as a warrant article so that we can assess on a yearly basis the benefits? Obviously, we've seen benefits for the last 2 years, at least for me. I'm interested in continuing it for a third year, but I think it would be good to allow to have that assessment take place on a yearly basis, and you'd be able to do that through a warrant article as opposed to making it into a position within the operating budget. So I guess my question is, what's the harm in not leaving it the way that it is?
So, John, I think that the basis for putting it in the warrant article, like we've done for a couple other things, are either it's a temporary position in nature, like in the the design and construction, the lifeguards, which we weren't sure we were going to need, and the PIO position, which was, let's test it out. The concern I have about keeping it in a warrant article is that you have an uncertainty every year as to whether the position will be funded. And so you don't know, I think it creates an uncertainty among incumbents as to whether they would be willing to stay in the position if, the town of Dedham, which is currently posted for a PIO, has one. So I think that there needs to be, in any employment situation, there's an expectation that we would provide some basis of the continuation of the position.
I agree with John's viewpoint. I think that's the best way to do it.
Madam Chair, I was in support of this position from its get-go. It made sense to me that the town wanted to digitize and move forward in that direction. And now, after we've been at this for 2 years, a person pretty much has gotten the flair of how the town works and how it can be the best speaking voice for the town in matters of consistency. And now I'm hearing that we want to take that away and have a person start possibly and not know that they're going to have this job next year. From an HR perspective, that really makes absolutely no sense to me if we want continuity in terms of content. And so if that person is willing to stay without the assuredness that they have a job the next year, I can't imagine keeping anyone worth their salt in this line of work this way. So I completely disagree with evaluating this every year. Either we keep the position and build that, make it stronger, or get rid of the position and give it to someone else who's already in the town. But to keep it hybrid this way doesn't seem to make much sense to me from an HR perspective and from a communication perspective. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thanks. Louise, I think was up first.
So I still think that COVID threw us a curveball and that it is difficult to evaluate the position because of COVID. There were certain requirements for the town during COVID. So, and I think we probably will be discussing this further in our budget discussions. The other question I would ask is whether this is commensurate with other positions in other towns in terms of salary, and that's information I know that we can get. That's it.
Dick, did you have a?
Yeah, I just wanted to endorse Rick's comments. I think making this on its face what appears to be a temporary position puts a significant hurdle in the hiring process. I think it's clear you need to evaluate the person each year, how the person's performing the function. But in order to get a qualified person, I think they've got to have some reasonable assurance that if they do perform well, the position will still be there.
Jim?
At the medical school a year ago, we never had 3 weekly town halls. We never had management councils. We never had letters sent on a Sunday. We never had any of these other publications and notices sent out, all of which came upon us because of COVID. So do I think that we're going to be in the same circumstance a year from now? I don't. I'm not sure we'll be in the same circumstance 9 months from now. So that's why I would suggest that we don't yet know what the long-term need is going to be for that position. I don't want to, if we determine that this person is a critical function for the town, then I don't want to do it on a year-to-year basis. I agree with Rick and Rick. I agree. But I'm not sure we're there yet. And so I agree with the other point, which was, do we know yet if we're here in terms of this being a permanent thing? And I'm not convinced of that.
Madam Chair,
Can I just go ahead, Rick?
can I ask then if the incumbent with Kate can strip away everything that's related to COVID and see the things that this position has been able to accomplish without it? I'd like to see that early on, and I'm not sure if we need a whole year to evaluate the importance of the position.
So, Louise?
I have a different question regarding this budget. Why is the software maintenance for applicant tracking going up by $10,000?
So the software maintenance isn't going up by $10,000. It's being transferred into our budget from the IT budget. It's
Okay.
per Dave's new policy, Louise.
Okay, got it. Thank you. I was worried for a minute.
Madam Chair,
Matt?
just to speak again on the PIO, and I understand the concerns, but I think what our ask is here, and if we can show, or we tend to show, that this position is valuable absent COVID, and I think we can back that up as we provide that information to you. And if we are able to do that, then we are asking, and I think to Rick's point, I think it's very unfair to any employee to have this year after year wondering and waiting if they're going to be hired for the next year, and to retain a qualified applicant. So I think our goal here is to get you the information, if I'm hearing correctly, saying that here are the accomplishments, or here's how this helps the town, absent COVID. And of course, COVID is a part, but we can push that aside, because in the future, there might be something, some other type of issue that has to be addressed. But put that aside for now. We can say, here are the accomplishments. And then once that's done, I would ask, or I think we would ask that if satisfactory, to all be a permanent position. I think the year to year would not be fair. It would not be the correct way to do business.
So I think the other thing that I was hearing is that we'd like to have some comparable information on, I mean, I know we looked at this when we discussed this 2 years ago, but what other towns' compensation for these types of positions in other towns, and maybe, Kate, what types of roles they play there as well.
I'll update that for you, Carol.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Chair, and let me be clear, I wasn't advocating it to be year by year. We did a 2-year warrant article, and my question is, why shouldn't we do another 2-year warrant article? I'm not saying year to year.
Madam Chair.
Josh.
So I guess I have a different unrelated question. I know there are some costs that may have been unanticipated during the current fiscal year. So I'm thinking of the investigator into the police incident last year, and then also the facilitator and any other costs for Nuwari. Are those coming out of the town manager's budget? And then are those also being carried over into fiscal year 2022's budget?
So the cost for the investigator and the legal advice is coming out of the legal budget for the Marvin Henry event. We have been able to provide some facilitation for Nuwari through our budget because in the pandemic year, nobody went to any professional development training events, so we were able to provide it that way. We are likely to be recommending to the select board as a warrant article in the 2022 21 annual town meeting, an appropriation for Nuwari to do additional facilitation and research in the next year. So that's something, but there's nothing in our budget for Nuwari carried forward.
Okay,
Hey,
thank you.
On that point of Nuwari, will the town warrant include a budget for social justice Needham, or how is that being funded? Or is it one effort?
Do you mean Equal Justice Needham?
Excuse me, Equal Justice Needham, yes.
As a private group, I don't.
They don't have any funding at all. They just have access at this point.
They're a private, unincorporated group of residents who have an interest in this matter, and we provide them information, but there's been we're not proposing any funding, and they've sought no funding.
Okay. Thank you.
And then I guess I just want to reiterate my point about the public information officer position. I think one of the big impediments to public access to municipal information is the website as it currently stands. So I think there can be tons of technical innovations that maybe don't need as much of an investment year over year. And I would like to see those done soon. I think that they may be able to avoid costs and additional personnel. I'm not sure about that, but in the discussion of the position, I'd like to know how we're aiming to improve the website and improve self-directed access to information.
Any other questions, comments? Okay. Should we turn to townwide expenses?
So that's an area that Tom, Jacob, and Jim Healy and I had some discussion with Dave Davidson on. As you all know, this is largely an area determined by actuarial and contractual relationships or terms of bond commitments. Yet there are some judgmental factors in this area, such as we have to estimate what the health insurance costs are likely to be, since those don't normally come to us until much later in the budget cycle. Also, partly in that context is an estimate of how many positions will have to be covered. But why don't I suggest that we listen to Dave go through the various items rather than me generalize.
Dave?
Madam Chair, you have the townwide expenses broken into two groups. The first group of items actually would be addressed by the town manager and her team.
Okay.
And then the second group listed on the agenda for 820 is what I would be addressing.
Okay.
Should we take up retirement first? I'm sorry, I wrote down the times, but not the individual items.
Sure.
Well, the first townwide expense items are health insurance, OPEB, retirement, workers' compensation.
So with respect to the group insurance budget that's proposed, we're assuming an 8% increase in health insurance premiums for FY22. This is within the range of recommendations from our consultants, and also it is near the top of the Group Insurance Commission's recommendations, which is ranging anywhere from 4 to 7. We are continuing the two types of plans that we offer: our benchmark plans, which are more traditional HMOs. About 42% of our employees are enrolled in those plans. And then we also have a qualified high deductible plan where 58% of our employees participate. Those are lower premium plans with a higher deductible, and for which the town pays a portion of the deductible into a health savings account. We also have an opt-out program in which employees can receive a payment for opting out of insurance. And we have about 40 employees as of the beginning of November who are participating in those plans. That's a cost to the town of $120,000, but a savings of almost $375,000. So we're netting at about $253,000 in carrying forward the opt-out plan. The health insurance budget also includes payment for the town's obligations for Medicare and Social Security. We typically do a review of the previous year's expenditures, but it's been a very challenging year with respect to hiring and the kinds of people who are hired and who were not hired. So we don't believe that our Medicare and Social Security in the past year is reflective of what we will be spending in FY22. So at this point, we've proposed that it be level funded. With respect to unemployment, we typically increase the unemployment by, sorry.
Can we stop for a second on just, I think it's important to note that in terms of the coverage for health insurance, it's almost 2-to-1 school over town employees.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just the way it breaks. But it's so that when we talk about adding positions in the school department, it also kicks up this budget.
That's correct. And it's an important point, Dick, in that if you look at the BVA, it does show that there's a DSR 4 for health insurance. That would be if the positions that are recommended in the town and the school are funded. That doesn't mean it's our recommendation for any of those items. Thank you for pointing that out. I just wanted to point out again on unemployment, we typically increase it by anticipated growth in revenue of about 4%. We have had significant increases in unemployment in FY21. We have, like everybody else, we're constantly managing whether claims, we are self-insured for unemployment. We're constantly monitoring whether claims are legitimate. Rachel and Chuck and their team are constantly reviewing those and making sure that we file in case that there may be incidents of fraud, which we've had many of, that we believe are probably fraud. We also have, as a self-insurer, somebody who leaves our employment to get another job and then gets laid off, or who works for us and loses a second job. We do pay a portion of that. So we have to be very diligent in going through that list. It may be that we have more costs and unemployment than we have budgeted for FY21, and maybe also going forward, and those would be included in any COVID-related funding article or mechanism that we'll be talking about for FY22. And we may, depending on what happens with the total health insurance budget, we may need a reserve fund transfer to cover the unemployment obligation. But we wouldn't know that until the Commonwealth has straightened out all of the cases, because every month we get credits for things that they've fixed or changed. And then finally, in workers' comp, where the medical costs continue to go up, and we've had some decent sized settlements that are good for getting long-term employees off of workers' comp and off of our rolls, but it does mean that our reserve has dipped into about 760,000. So depending on availability of funding, we may be seeking additional funding in the warrant for increasing the reserve for workers' compensation.
Are municipalities required to self-fund unemployment?
They're not required to self-fund, but Dave has probably 2 or 3 times done an analysis of what an insurance product would cost us, and every time we have significantly benefited by it being self-insured.
Okay.
Josh?
I had a question about the injury on duty in 11F line. So I think that's new. Is that a cost over and above what has been paid in the past, or is this just taking the cost away from a different line item and putting it here?
So it's always been lumped together with workers' compensation, and we've separated it out this year because we are proposing that we set up a special fund in for injury on duty in 111F, so that for workers' compensation, that budget, if they're not expended, they can be rolled into a special account and then be used for claims of the year. So any budget that was available at the end of FY20 was rolled into an account for claims of FY20, and it could be saved and used for those claims. That has not been true for injury on duty in 111F, and it is now possible. So that we wanted to separate these out so that at the end of FY, say that it were in place this year at the FY21, that they could be rolled into that account and could be used to pay claims as we do with the workers' comp. So it would be a separate fund, separate from the workers' comp fund.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Louise?
Just a couple of questions. So on unemployment, do you, so I think everybody's in the same boat. I agree with you, Kate. So there is CARES Act funding for COVID-related unemployment. Are you seeing any additional unemployment so that you might believe that the 4% would not be sufficient going forward? Not related to COVID.
It's really difficult to say this year because we have seen a number of claims for second jobs. So we do only pay a portion. Chuck, make sure I have this right, but we do only pay a portion of that. But, you know, if you have an employee who was having a second job as a bartender, you know, there might be, but I don't know enough to request more. So I think that it's best to keep it level and then hope for the vaccine and that those second jobs are back and that people who have left us to get different jobs get reemployed. So I don't know enough to ask for more. And if it continues, we would probably put it in the non-COVID, we don't know. COVID, we would put in a separate request.
And then with respect to workers' comp and injury on duty, do you have a goal for what you want to have in reserve?
Dave, can you speak to that?
Yes, it's been identified by an actuarial, and in fact, the Department of Revenue now hits our free cash certification that we have estimated aggregate liabilities of about $1.1 million. So that would not be covered by stop loss insurance. So that would be the level that we would want our reserve to be at. And then, of course, our annual ongoing cost would be the appropriation of every year.
So what is the reserve at now?
The reserve is at about 700,000.
763.
Oh, 763. I see it. The July 1, 2020 balance. Got it. Okay. With a goal of $1 million or 1.1 million.
Yes, 1.1.
Okay.
Dick?
Kate, on both the OPEB and the retirement, could you walk us through, there are two key assumptions that drive the funding requirements there. Well, one is the actual projection, but one is the assumed rate of return and two is the target funding date. So could you walk us through what's happening with respect to both of those elements?
Well, I'll start and then I'll ask Evie to make sure that I have it right. But with respect to the rate of return, our Siegel is our actuary for the retirement board, and Siegel was looking at the PRIT return based on their Siegel advisors ranges for forward-looking and medium geometric returns, and those range for the 5, 10, and 25-year periods from between 6 and 6.96 or 7%. So while some of the other estimates, even PRIT's estimate for the coming year is higher than 7, Siegel's recommendation is to be in the middle of that 6 to 7 range. And so they've recommended to the retirement board that they bring the rate of return down to 6.5%, which the retirement board voted to do.
And that will cost about what per year?
Well, let's see.
I think Dave
I do have that.
200. I thought Dave said 200, around 200,000 a year.
So the increase, yes. So it's actually 300. So if you look at, and Evelyn and the retirement board had the actuary create the schedule so you can actually do the math. So that in FY22, it would have been 300 if you kept it at 2030, Dick, instead of 2033, which is what we extended to. It would have been 309,000 more, 687,000 in 23, and then 1.1 million in 24. So the retirement board felt that the extension of the schedule to 2033 was appropriate to try to keep the increasing actuarial annual year to year at the just over 9%. I would point out that the returns, you did ask Dick for the return, as of November 30th, the FY21 return for the PRIT fund was 11.65% for the fiscal year, and the calendar year 20 at that point was 7.8, and I actually think it'll be a little higher, but the December 31 number doesn't come out until the middle of the month. But because the returns in 18 and 19, the net of those returns, the 12/31/19 return was 15%. That has given us an unrecognized investment return of about $6.7 million. So that's not factored into this analysis. So that we smooth it in, Evelyn, I don't remember the number of years, but 3 to 5 years is when that's smoothed in. Is that correct?
It's smoothed over 5 years at a specific percentage for each year, from 80% down to about 20% of those gains and any losses that we've incurred.
Does everyone understand what's just being said? Rather than impact a given year with the full amount, the performance, both positive and negative, is spread over 5 years, so it moderates or modulates the impact of any given year.
So the hope might be, Madam Chair and Dick, that if the market continues not to be in terrible shape, that we might be able to cut off these 3 years based on the on good returns. So all in all, I think it's a plan that makes a lot of sense. Evie, I'm sorry, Madam Chair, if I could turn it over to Evie if she wants to add to that.
Nope, you're fine. I have no other comments.
Thanks.
We also have another board member on the call this evening, and that's Ms. Sincata. So Sandy, if you would like to offer any comments, I want to take advantage of your expertise in the area.
I think that it's been very eloquently put by our town manager and you, Evie. Thank you.
I don't mean to put you on the spot. I'm sorry.
And then you had asked about the OPEB. So with respect to the retiree insurance liability fund, that's also invested in PRIT. So all of the foregoing remarks are the same. This, we are still relying on an actuarial analysis that is 6/30/19. So we're using the same funding schedule for that, which was a 6.75% rate of return. So we expect that when we complete the next OPEB actuarial, we will be seeking the reduction to 6.5 so that they'll once again be on the same track.
As people may or may not have noticed, the funding level on the retiree retirement is roughly 65% of where we need to be, and for OPEB, it's 35%.
I would say that 35% is probably in the top half of 1%.
We are a giant among short-statured people.
Louise.
Could I ask a question about OPEB? So with OPEB, we're paying our ongoing liabilities out of the operating budget for retirees, and this is for future?
No, we consolidated them, I think 2008. So we pay the pay-as-you-go for retiree health insurance through this fund.
Yes.
If you think about this appropriation is 7.3 million. And annually, we're spending between 2.8 and 3 million for retiree health insurance. So the balance of it is all going towards the unfunded liability.
Thank you.
Any further questions on this component?
And again, this is not for the schools, correct? This is just town employees?
The health is for the schools earlier, but the retirement is not.
Right.
I would point out that there's a significant number of school employees in the town retirement system. I don't have it off the top of my head, but it's a high number. All the paraprofessionals, the cafeteria workers, the administrative assistants, all of those employees are not part of MTRS, so there's a big number. But with respect to OPEB, we provide the teachers and people who have a teaching role in the schools. Their pension is paid by the state, but we pay all of the health insurance for all retirees, including the schools.
Teachers, yeah.
Teachers.
Okay, moving on to the next agenda item, townwide expenses, casualty insurance, debt service, Needham Electric Reserve Fund.
Madam Chair, just the classification and performance and settlements
Oh, yeah.
is still there. I don't know if anybody had any questions. It's pretty straightforward.
Sure, sorry.
As you all recall, this including in addition to bonus funding for eligible employees, this also covers where we carry the provision for contracts that may get approved during the course of the year. And then they get moved out of this into the budgets for the respective areas whose contracts have been approved.
Does anybody have any questions on that at all? Okay.
So Madam Chair, means that Sandy and Chuck and Rachel can head out. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you very much. And Dave, did you want to?
Certainly. Madam Chair, we have, for townwide expenses, we still have the casualty liability, property and self-insurance program, debt service, the Needham Electric Light and Gas program, and then rounding everything up is the Finance Committee's Reserve Fund. First, with the casualty and liability line item, we are looking at an increase just under 14% over the current year's budget. What's driving that expense particularly is that we just have more assets to cover on our property insurance with the number of buildings that have opened or are scheduled to open the last few years. I do note in the write-up the various buildings that have added to our coverage includes an expansion at the high school, the opening of the Rosemary Recreation Complex, the fuel depot at 470 Dedham Avenue, the new Memorial Park Field House, the modular classrooms that were added at the Mitchell School, certainly the Sunita Williams Elementary School, the Jack Cogswell building, communication towers, and what has opened up this year is the new fire headquarters, and impacting next year's budget will be the opening of Station 2, and rounding up the end of the year will be the police station. So with those items, that is the greatest driver of the increases that we have seen in insurance in the last couple of years. Another thing that, and I don't know the specifics why, but for reinsurance, we acquire our insurance through our collaborative Maya. And with that, there is a self-insured pool of many municipalities and school districts. And like any entity, just as we do on our workers' compensation, they have self-insurance, and stop-loss insurance premiums have been going up, both in the private and public sector. And I'm not certain what specifically is driving that, but it is another variable that's impacting our rates. It impacted the rates this year and next year. And lastly, another area that there are increases, and again, this is general, not surprising, professional liability insurances premiums for governmental entities have been increasing as well. And with that, any questions?
David,
Yeah.
didn't have occasion to ask this question when we were together before, but a lot of times insurance policies have exclusions for civil unrest. Do our policies have an exclusion for that? And if so, are we at risk?
There are, what's unique about the Maya program is it's dedicated only to municipal governments, and the policies and the risk factors incorporate certain immunities that are afforded municipalities. And aid programs that might become available. So our risk, there are exclusions, but the exclusions are areas that the state provides indemnification to the municipality.
So, I mean, hopefully it wouldn't happen, but if there were a major civil unrest involving town hall, we'd be covered?
Property damage, we would be covered. The greater issue,
obviously, yeah.
But the indemnification that folks cannot sue the government because of the unrest of other people. Private industry, of course, has a great exposure because often there's exclusions in policies for riots and such that there's not coverage, but that's not an issue for the town.
Okay. Debt service?
Debt service. Well, the debt service budget is effectively what it is. It represents everything that has already passed. Most of it is items that have already been bonded or projects that are underway with the estimated debt service in the years. A couple of components. Fiscal 2021 is the peak year for debt service paid on the tax levy, the excluded debt. We will start to see a drop off in that debt. That's based upon all the projects that have already been approved, and also factoring the portions that are excluded that will be bonded over the next 24 months. Most notably, the public safety building, we have approximately $35 million to go. in borrowings, and we still have a residual amount associated with the Williams School that, depending upon the results of the audit with the MSBA, the portion that the MSBA doesn't accept, the town will have to permanently finance that share. CPA, both projects that are authorized funded by CPA debt has been bonded. That's a debt service that's declining and will continue to decline. And our debt within the levy limit is structured around working around that 3%. Debt service this year for 21 is at 3%. Our debt service requirement for 22 is projected at 3%. And just on the debt that has been approved, not yet borrowed, and items which appear in the capital plan recommended to be financed by debt within the levy limit, those estimates are incorporated in the future assumptions, and we're seeing a declining of the debt going down to 2.4 in 23 and declining about 0.1% per year going out, and then a big good drop off in 2026. I would presume that other projects may arise, but the projects that are currently being recommended are factored into all the assumptions. But most importantly, what you're discussing today is fiscal 22, and the debt budget is what the debt we have to pay in 2022.
So when you say all projects are factored into this debt budget, all projects that are concluding or in existence or in a process?
Correct. All the projects that have already been approved and are still ongoing and will complete, and the estimated costs associated to finish the financing, and those projects that are being recommended to be funded by debt in the most current capital plan in the next 5 years, which includes 2 different fire vehicles. They include additional funding for the public safety building. They include one other item in the general fund, and I'm looking at right up now.
Thank you.
The Paulet School air conditioning project. So those are the 4 projects, and I'll repeat them again. The public safety building project, which will be taken up, currently estimated 1.7, proposed to be funded by debt within the levy limit. Paulet School air conditioning, a little over $1.3 million to be funded within the levy limit. A Quint ladder truck estimated cost $1.8 million proposed to be funded within the levy limit, and fire engine proposed to, at $900,000 to be funded in the levy limit. These are all not coming before you this year. The public safety building is coming before the committee this year in 22. The air conditioning is in 23. The Quint ladder truck is in fiscal 24, and the fire engine is in 25.
Thank you.
But the figure 20.7 million, which is in the book, is for debt that will be on the books and payable through June 30, 2022.
Correct.
Okay, electric bills.
The electric budget is one of the budgets, in addition to the debt service budget, that is declining for fiscal 22. It's a slight decline, a little over 1%. And that's in spite of additional demand coming online with the new buildings, the Williams School and then the public safety buildings that are coming online. But the work from our building maintenance folks in terms of doing energy efficiency steps and some improvements that were done with our streetlights has lowered the load. So although our KWH is up and buildings are up, when compared to how systems used to operate, they're actually more efficient. We have seen a decline in natural gas pricing, which is also impacting this budget estimate. And the last thing, just to remind the committee members, we also pay for the solar power that's generated by Tesla for the town, which we then sell to the grid, to Eversource, which the town makes money on. And it also, our streetlight maintenance program is funded through here.
So, excuse me, Dave.
Yep.
To what extent is some of the reduction in costs from, as you mentioned, you write up lower consumption because of schools being closed in 2020?
That was referring in FY 20, the year that just closed out. We had a higher turnback in part because facilities were closed and therefore we had less usage. As folks return to the buildings, usage will increase. But the other thing that is true, and you had this conversation last week when you were going over the DPW budget, and Barry and Cecilia are both here as well to remind you on the questions. Because of some things that we're doing with air in the buildings, we're actually using more power now than we did pre-COVID because of the air circulation and air handling systems. And in fact, I was just looking at the comparison of the percent of the amount that has been billed for the first 6 months of 2021 and comparing that to the first 6 months of 2019, and we're up about 4%. And again, the important thing, 2019, because 2020 is an aberration.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the last item here is the reserve fund. And as many of you will recall, we arrive at this on a formula basis, taking a percentage of the variable items that are in the budget, those items that are subject to change, but we exclude from that calculation those things that are fixed and not subject to change as we go through the course of the year. One of the things we did discuss was whether or not we should adjust that because of the unknown impact of COVID going forward, and he was disinclined to recommend that. So that may be something we want to discuss.
And Madam Chair, although this is prepared and submitted by the Finance Committee, in terms of the conversation, understandably the concern with costs that may that may be difficult to determine and will be temporary with COVID-19. The approach that we would prefer is to do a financial warrant article for those costs so that they're specific to COVID-19.
Louise, you're muted.
Sorry.
That's okay.
I'm just talking away. I think I asked this last time, but one of the things that would be helpful is the accounting of where we are with the CARES Act and what is left in the account that we anticipate we will have in fiscal year 22 for the first half of the fiscal year. And then in terms of the reserve fund in general, I think I have said this for a couple of years, maybe we do want to review the formula. It does still seem a little high for the reserve fund. I don't think we've expended the reserve fund in a number of years. So we might want to look at that.
Madam Chair.
Sorry, Josh.
So along the same lines, I'm just curious, what are our policies for prioritizing transfers from the reserve fund versus going to a stabilization fund? I know both have been used infrequently, probably the reserve fund more often, but are there principles on when we use the reserve fund versus stabilization?
Well, stabilization can't be used unless town meeting appropriates the funds. Town meeting also appropriates the funds to the reserve fund, which is available for the finance committee to authorize a transfer of funds to another operating budget expense that was unforeseen or emergency at the time of the budget formation. And that's the legal principle behind that. So stabilization is a funding source. It's not something that I can just go spend.
Right, but I guess we...
So you would appropriate the stabilization fund to a budget, and then you can spend the budget.
Mm-hmm.
We would do that with the reserve fund. I mean, a reserve fund would be transferred to a certain line item, right?
No, you confused. A town meeting appropriates money to a reserve fund to which the finance committee can authorize the transfer, but the appropriation has been made. If it stays in the reserve fund, it still closes out at the end of the fiscal year.
Yes, I guess just what I'm asking is, if there's some unanticipated expense, I can understand transferring from the reserve fund to another line item in between town meetings, in between a special or an annual town meeting. But I think, in my experience, sometimes we wait for a town meeting or we call a new special town meeting if there's an unexpected expense for that same appropriation. So if we're willing to do that, to call a special town meeting, then in theory, we could fund the same thing from either source, correct?
That is correct. Town meeting could be called for an appropriation, and the funding source could be identified as the stabilization fund, and you would reduce the stabilization fund and increase the appropriation. And then that becomes if it's in the operating budget, that becomes your new base.
Some of the stabilization funds are very specific though, so you couldn't necessarily use a stabilization fund for a purpose other than what it was designed for. Secondly, I think the question that Louise asked and your question are linked. One of the reasons one might conclude that you could reduce the reserve fund is to say, well, we could cover ourselves through the stabilization funds. I think the problem with that is once you've taken the money out of the stabilization fund, then you've got to have a separate vote in the subsequent year to replace that money, or else it's gone forever. Whereas the reserve fund gets voted on each year, so it renews each year and is a much more flexible vehicle.
The amount that's in the reserve fund is as much or sometimes more than what's currently in the stabilization funds.
If you're speaking of the general stabilization fund, which is what I was assuming you were referring to, the reserve fund has never been $4 million.
No, but capital, for instance.
Yes, but you can't transfer money from a reserve. Finance committee cannot transfer funds from the reserve fund to anything but the operating budget. It cannot transfer it to a capital appropriation, for instance.
I just don't see the advantage of depleting the stabilization funds versus when there is adequate funding in the reserve fund. On the other hand, you could have Louise's point is if you funded the reserve fund less, there would be more money for the operating budget or reduce the budget. But once it's started, it seems to me you want to exhaust the reserve fund before you look to use the stabilization funds. At least that's my personal view.
Louise, did you have a comment?
So I was just going to say, I think if we look at them together, it might be helpful. We haven't used the stabilization fund in a really, really, really long time. And it seems to me that the stabilization fund is made for just the type of emergency, public health emergency that we had this year. So the town right now is not in the position where we've seen a revenue shortfall. That could happen. I actually think fiscal year 22 is not the year we're going to feel the revenue shortfalls from the pandemic. The year we're going to feel them is fiscal year 2023. And I think that's exactly what the stabilization fund is meant to fund. If we see a reduction in either state aid in fiscal year 2023 or, you know, our projections are whatever they normally are, Dave puts together projections and then we see that either excise taxes are going to not come in where there's anticipated or some other type of local receipt. That's exactly what the stabilization fund is for, to carry us through that dip, which is due to a particular event. I think the reserve fund is really more for those things that occur unexpectedly in the course of town operations. So, you know, we have a truck, we didn't anticipate we were going to replace it for 2 years, something happens, and now we have to replace it this year. That's a reserve fund transfer. Snow and ice, weather, those kinds of things. So I see them as really serving two very different purposes, but I still think the reserve fund is a little overfunded the way it is.
I agree with 98% of what Louise just said.
Excellent. 98% is good.
Which begs the question, what's the other 2%?
Exactly. I didn't want to ask.
Overfunded.
So maybe
we're a committee of how many ever we are when we're fully.
You may recall Louise and I were on a special committee looking at reserve funds a couple of years ago.
Yep. Yeah.
So you're right. Maybe we should revisit the formula.
Or let's just look at it. I mean, periodically, it's good to revisit what are our assumptions. And
you can be sure that when we do cut it down, we'll have a big snowy winter.
I know that.
Let's not do it now then. Okay. Any other questions? Comments?
Actually, Dave, I know I brought this up to you earlier. Given all the projects that are on the potential projects on the horizon, it would be very helpful if we could do some what if scenarios with our debt, the impact on the debt amounts from some of these potential projects, or look at it differently. What would be available under our guidelines to borrow?
Well, and I would add, at what time? Timing is everything.
I'm pretty sure Dave does that every year. He's got a.
Yeah, we are actually over the 10%.
No, I know we are. No, I know we are. I know.
In answer, as I said to the committee previously, this early spring, you will have an updated facility financing plan once we get by the budget. And once we get by the budget, I will start working on that. But I need one other guidance that I'm waiting on, and that's decisions by the stakeholders of which project or projects and when they want projects to begin in order to
No, I'm asking for something different. I'm almost asking for sort of just some guidelines for us at borrowings of certain dollar amounts in future years, the impact of, based on what we know today, what the impact is on our percentages, the 3% and the 10% number, which I realize we're already in excess of, because that's going to influence what projects can get done when, or when we, and I believe it will significantly influence the timing of those projects, as opposed to stakeholders coming back to us and saying, we want this project in this year. What is, and you cranking out the numbers as to what that does. I'd almost rather see us have, at least from it would be helpful in the discussions that are going to happen around those projects to have some hypotheticals based on what we know now, what is potentially available to borrow under certain assumptions, if that makes any sense.
I understand what you're saying, and relative, and I do this regularly for water and sewer, and within the 3%. I have never taken it upon myself to make any assumption that the voters will be passing debt exclusions of any amount. That I would need policymakers to make a decision of what they would like considered for funding by debt exclusion.
I think those are kind of obvious, which projects would have to be.
No, but I guess I think what Barry's saying, and maybe if I'm wrong, is if just holding to 10%, what would be available to borrow, holding to that 10% over the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years.
Or conversely, if we made the decision, and we are obviously we're not adhering to the 10%. If we made pick a reasonable number that we think a number that won't meaningfully impact our. And I realize this is very hypothetical, and there's a lot of policy issues around it. But I guess what's going to be, I want to be able to have a good understanding, even if it means the project would cost more money, if it helps smooth our payments over time to delay something a year or two because of that, that would be helpful in the decision making on when these projects should happen, from a purely financing perspective, not from any other perspective. I don't know, it may be too many assumptions to make it reasonable, but I think we're always trying to squeeze these policies into our framework of debt compliance, right? And make it work. And I'd almost rather try to work the other way if at all possible. Know what we can borrow, and that influence more the timing and how these projects get brought forward.
Certainly, we can have more of a conversation, and I can develop some scenarios, but the 10% has worked, and it has dictated when projects have worked. There have been certain periods that it would be over 10%, but only for a few years.
Right.
Because remember, when you pass a debt exclusion, that increases your revenue for the purposes of the 10%. So as I said, do you want me to assume at 200 million? I get 20 million. Assume 300 million, get 30 million. So that's what I meant by the policy of making it an arbitrary number that the voters are going to approve, whereas having a specific project with an identified cost, I can show you what it will have, what the cost will be if we did the project this year. And I can show you what the impact would be if that same project was delayed by a few years.
What? I think that's what, Barry, is not what you're, I think that's what you're saying, is we're looking at a scenario, trying to develop scenarios around timing.
Right.
I do understand that. It's just, is it the Mitchell School? Is it the Pollitt School? Is it, that's the guidance that I'm looking for. Which is the greater
Yes,
priority?
those two projects specifically. Those are the two significant projects in the relative near-term horizon.
Correct, but which one? Because the cost associated was substantially different.
Right, and I think that's I think the frustration, at least my own personal frustration, is that we've sort of been presented with this the schools have presented this master plan of $260 million of projects in 7 years, right? And my gut, and it's not a very smart one, but my gut is that we can't afford that. And so I'm like, so then the question is, well, what can we afford? And is there a way to say that, within our limits, we can afford $70 million? And then if we tell them it's $70 million, that I think would govern, or at least maybe help them be more realistic about what they're actually going to propose, as opposed to saying, we're proposing everything here, you guys,
Figure out how to finance.
Figure out how to fund it. And I'd rather say to them, this is what you have to spend. You guys have that. Now you decide which you think is your priority for spending. I'll use that figure, $70 million.
Again, we'll have something developed comparable to the last time when we were looking at several very expensive projects, which, if I recall, the Finance Committee was satisfied with the approach, and I can do the same thing as was done back then.
That would be great.
Madam Chair, this conversation just reminds me of a conversation we had 2 years ago related to revenues. As the debt service goes down over the next, or projected to go down over the next couple of years, I guess that's related to excluded debt, I imagine. The levy will go down proportionally as well. Could we get a kind of a comparison of the levy over time as it relates to the levy limit over time? How close are we getting to that each year? I may have used the incorrect terms. I'm sorry about that.
I think I know what you mean, and that's easy enough to show. We're generally, we've been at the levy limit most years. So.
Okay.
In fact, the policies read quite different. The levy limit, the 3%, is the town shall spend 3% on capital items. The 10% is we will try to keep it within 10%. So the two very different phraseologies. But the 3% within the levy is designed to make sure we spend that much on capital projects.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking from more of a revenue side of things. So from a taxpayer perspective, I think everyone's concerned that taxes have gone up progressively over time. And I know a big contributor of that has been the excluded debt.
Yep.
And as that excluded debt reduces, we're currently in the peak year, as that goes down, I think there's a hope among some people that the levy will also go down. I mean, the levy limit will also be increasing over time, so it's possible that that's not the case. But being able to track those figures may be helpful as we budget our expenditures to make sure that we I guess this is a policy issue that I think the Finance Committee should be involved in. Just as we want to make sure that budgets are not fluctuating greatly over time, I think we want to make sure that personal property taxes, and residential property taxes are not fluctuating greatly over time. And to the extent that they can be stabilized or even reduced, I would be in favor of that.
In the past, we've had bar charts which show debt plus excluded debt then as a percentage of the, and we projected it out several years, and that sounds like what you're asking for.
Yes, but in addition, so that's on the expenditure side. I think how that impacts revenues is also what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's something that is provided when I do that facility financing plan. Because debt exclusion, you only raise the amount on the taxpayer, the amount that has to be paid, whether you call it an expenditure or a revenue. When it's specific to the excluded debt, it's one and the same.
Anything, yeah, along those lines would be, for a facilities financing plan would be very helpful. Does anybody have anything else? Do I have a motion to adjourn until next week?
So moved.
Second?
Great. Roll call vote. Dick?
Yes.
Rick, you already said yes. Louise? Yes.
Yes.
Tom?
Yes.
Josh?
Yes.
John?
Yes.
Barry?
An enthusiastic yes.
Okay, and myself, yes. Till next week.
Bye.
Thank you all.